Good evening, everyone. We're just going to give us a few minutes to all get logged in. Thank you so much for joining us. Just give us a few minutes and I see the numbers ticking up as we are starting. So we'll get started in just a brief moment. Hello, everyone. I see folks joining us. Thank you for coming tonight. We're just going to allow for another 30 seconds before we get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Meredith Ritchie. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am the Director of Communications here at the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. Thank you for joining us for our Education Series event, Out and on the Street, LGBTQ+ Youth Homelessness. This is one of the topics that we were asked by you, viewers and community members, to talk about. And so I'm pleased to have some really great panelists here tonight who are going to speak on this topic and encourage us all to act as great community members and learn more about LGBTQ youth homelessness. So the panelists for tonight include Dr. Alexander Wumboldt from One Colorado, Shauna Kempinen from The Place, and Dr. Eric Attard from Peak Vista Community Health Center with The Place. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Dr. Al is going to start first. So you are all aware, as this evening continues, you will post any questions you may have into the Q&A that's at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many as we possibly can. Some might be in the chat and some might be live. If you want to chat with your other community members, please feel free to do so in the chat. And this event is an hour long. And we'll have 10-minute presentations from each of our three panelists and then take the rest of the evening to answer your questions. So without further ado, I am going to make sure that I'm going to turn off my video and leave it to you, Dr. Al.
Thank you, Meredith. Good evening, folks. My name is Dr. Alexander Wumboldt. I use he, him pronouns. And as Meredith said, I'm the Youth and Schools Program Manager over at One Colorado. Let me see if I can successfully share my screen, which is always an adventure. Hopefully folks see a giant blue One Colorado slide here. Please let me know if that is not the case.
You're good.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you for having me tonight. Wanted to provide a little context on the issue of LGBTQ youth homelessness and talk a little bit about kind of the facts that we know about young people who are LGBTQ and experiencing homelessness, as well as provide some recommendations for folks on things that we all can do kind of starting now on ways to alleviate this issue in our communities. So to start out with, want to just be the nerd that my title might suggest. I am a sociocultural anthropologist and doctor of public health by training. And before I present on statistics of communities that are facing disproportionate negative outcomes, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we should understand those statistics and what those statistics mean. And so with that, before talking a little bit more about statistics on LGBTQ young people who are experiencing homelessness, I wanted to talk a little bit about this thing called structural stigma and what that means. And so as we can see in this very, very social science jargon-laden first definition here, structural stigma are societal level conditions, cultural norms, and institutional practices that constrain the opportunities, resources, and well-being for stigmatized populations, which Great, I'm sure that is super clear. Let's parse that into human words now. And so really when we talk about structural stigma, what we're talking about is the way that we have built our society and our culture in terms of the things we do every day, in terms of our institutions like our government and the services it provides, even in terms of physical architecture and the way we've kind of built things, that building of society is going to disproportionately advantage some people and also put some people at disproportionate risk of negative things happening to them. And so structural stigma is really talking about that disproportionality of those negative outcomes happening for people who fall under more stigmatized populations. So what does this look like? Well, for LGBTQ young people, can actually picture a map of the United States and think about looking at all sorts of policies that are in place, all the way from an individual school up through state policies that exist to prevent discrimination against LGBTQ people. So if we made a map of those and say the more layers of protective and anti-discrimination policies there are for LGBTQ folks, that area is going to get more purple in them. We then put that map next to a map of LGBTQ young folks' risks of suicidality and homelessness. And so you could say, make the map more red in all of those places where young people are more likely to experience suicidal thoughts or homelessness. If we put those maps next to each other, we would see that the areas that are the most purple are, conversely, the areas where we see the lowest risk for young people experiencing homelessness and suicidality. And conversely, the areas that are the least purple, or where we have the least amount of protective policies in places for LGBTQ folks, are the same areas where we see the most risk of suicidality and homelessness for LGBTQ folks. So what's happening here? Well, when we look at these, really we're looking at the fact that communities that are willing to protect and value LGBTQ people, in turn, even if those protections and values, say like a workplace discrimination protection, don't necessarily seem like they're directly related to the issue of homelessness or related to a person's mental well-being. In fact, when we look at this on aggregate, we can see that those policies provide a really important protective factor in keeping people from experiencing these difficult outcomes. So on the flip side, when we're looking at areas that have higher rates of anti-LGBTQ discrimination, we can also see higher risks of homelessness and suicide for LGBTQ people, as well as poor mental health and substance use disorders generally. And so in talking about structural stigma, we're really talking about when we see these disproportionate rates, it's not that there's something about LGBTQ people that say intrinsically makes them more likely to experience poor mental health. Rather, we're talking about the fact that LGBTQ people in communities where they face higher amounts of discrimination are more likely to experience these negative outcomes where we see these really disproportionate statistics. So with all of that being said, why am I talking about structural stigma tonight? The big reason is I want to give the framework in talking about LGBTQ youth homelessness of really talking about shared risks here. So my argument would be that we cannot and should not approach homelessness for the LGBTQ community as a siloed effort. Really, we need to be talking about the issues faced by LGBTQ people in terms of homelessness alongside the issues faced in discrimination, the issues faced in poor mental health and suicidality, and the issues faced in substance use, because these things are really interrelated at a deep level. Just as a way to illustrate that, one of the most common reasons that LGBTQ young people who are experiencing homelessness describe the reason that they are homelessness is actually as a protective strategy that they've taken for themselves to avoid becoming suicidal in what they've identified as actually their main source of risk, which is an unsupportive home or family life. And so that lack of an affirming home in many LGBTQ young people's own narratives is what made them strategically choose to leave that home and to experience homelessness instead of having the negative mental health implications of being in that unaffirming environment. And so in approaching these things in a shared risks framework, I would say there's also a really big opportunity for us to look at these interconnections so that we can allow for more effective prevention on all of these issues to come together when it comes to protecting our young LGBTQ folks. So with that, what do we know about LGBTQ young people in Colorado and LGBTQ folks who experience homelessness? Well, from the 2019 Healthy Kids of Colorado survey, which is one of our best data sources on young people's gender identity and sexual orientation in Colorado, we know that roughly 10% of Colorado high school students identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. We know that, again, roughly 5% of Colorado high school students are unsure of their sexual orientation. Don't want to imply that those students are LGBTQ per se, just saying that at the point where they were surveyed, they're not sure what their sexual orientation is. So they might be LGBTQ later on, they might not be. Similarly, when we look at gender identity through that Healthy Kids data, we can see that roughly 1% of Colorado high school students identify as transgender, and another about 1.5% of Colorado high school students are unsure of their gender identity. Again, not implying that those are young folks who are going to identify as transgender later on in their life. So at the point they're being surveyed, they're unsure of what their gender identity is there. When it comes to homelessness faced by LGBTQ folks, there's some really profound disparities that we see. Even among young people experiencing homelessness, there's still big gaps between LGBTQ young folks and their cisgender heterosexual peers. So one of the big things just to discuss is that homelessness and unfortunately suicide are pretty entwined issues. In fact, suicide is the leading cause of death among young people who experience homelessness. And particularly for LGBTQ young people experiencing homelessness, they are almost twice as likely to die of an early death as cisgender heterosexual young people who experience homelessness. In addition, almost 3 times the amount of LGBTQ young people who experience homelessness report exchanging sex for basic needs compared to their cisgender heterosexual peers. So again, much more likelihood to need to engage in sex as a means of meeting their basic needs than their cisgender heterosexual peers, which again is just placing people in that higher risk category. In addition, over 40% of young people who experience homelessness also experience depression, which is about 12 percentage points higher than the rate experienced by housed young folks in the United States. And last, and again, really hard facts here, so thank you for bearing with me. For traditionally school-aged young people who experience homelessness, they're about 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than their housed peers who are living with their parent or guardian. So we are talking about young people who are really at risk of a lot of really negative outcomes happening at once here. Oof. Okay, so what can we do about it? Well, given the structure of shared risk and structural stigma, I want to encourage all of us that we can really start taking action on this right away. So to start with, let's talk about acting upstream. So one of the great ways that we can act on these difficult issues is making sure that we're putting those preventative factors in place as early as we can. As I talked about on that first slide, just looking at that map of where there are protective policies and anti-discrimination policies for LGBTQ people, in turn makes it much less likely that LGBTQ folks in those areas are going to experience homelessness or suicidality in the first place. And so let's work to pass anti-discrimination policies and legislation really at any level in our communities. That can be, again, looking at the school board all the way up through the state level. Any amount of these protective policies we can put into place have been found scientifically to reduce that structural stigma for LGBTQ people. So this is a great time to think about getting involved in local politics and to vote for pro-equality candidates and measures. If you're curious about what those are, we at One Colorado for every election do put out recommendations on pro-equality candidates and are more than happy to help folks who would like to volunteer get involved in local politics and in state level politics that are going to be putting these protective policies in place for LGBTQ folks. So please reach out to us at One Colorado if that is work you'd like to be involved in. Similarly, this is work we can be doing at that school level. And so check with your local school district to see if they have evidence-based inclusivity practices for LGBTQ young people in place that have been found to lower the rates of young people experiencing homelessness. So in particular there, Ask about Gender and Sexuality Alliance Clubs, or GSAs. If you are of a generation slightly younger than me, but older than current students, you might also know these as Gay Straight Alliance Clubs. These have been found to be one of the most protective measures we can put into place in a school for LGBTQ young people. In addition, ask your school or local district if they use gender support plans, or GSPs. These are a great policy to help support young people who are transgender or gender non-binary, and making sure that their gender identity is being respected throughout the school system. And so check in with those local folks, and if they don't have these policies in place, advocate them to start a GSA or to implement a gender support plan for their students. In addition, one thing I hope that you take away from me talking tonight is just being thoughtful about how we talk about the issues experienced by LGBTQ people. And so don't just label LGBTQ folks as being at high risk for these negative outcomes. Instead, we want to recenter that conversation on what produces that risk in the first place and work to develop empathy for LGBTQ people's experiences. So instead of just stating that LGBTQ folks are more likely to experience homelessness or more likely to experience suicidality, let's talk about that why, which ultimately is that they're in communities where they face a high degree of discrimination and where folks face a high degree of uncertainty about what opportunities they might have because of that discrimination. Similarly, last big thing I want to take away here is remembering that when we're talking about young people, we culturally tend to have an idea that issues of gender and sexual orientation are for older folks, closer to an adult age, and science really doesn't bear that out. So according to current psychiatric and psychological research, there's really a consensus that most children have a pretty firm sense of their gender identity in terms of whether or not their sex assigned at birth corresponds with that gender identity by the age of 3. Moreover, for transgender and gender non-binary people who eventually get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which is a symptom of acute distress in really feeling as though your body and your physical presentation, which can be voice, can be your physical body there, don't match up with your internal sense of self and your identity. For transgender and gender non-binary people who eventually get that gender dysphoria diagnosis, which is not everyone, but a fair share of folks will get that diagnosis within our community, most people experience the onset of significant symptoms of gender dysphoria by the age of 6. And so really, when we're talking about LGBTQ folks and the risks here, talking about all age levels, we want to make sure that our advocacy is including younger people there who can indeed have a very legitimate sense of their identity and whether or not the sex they were assigned at birth or whether or not a presumption that they are heterosexual really matches with their authentic selves. Lastly, with this, something I want to encourage everyone to take away from this presentation is just getting better about using people's pronouns and changing our cultural etiquette around this to better invite LGBTQ folks into our communities. So you probably all noticed that I began this presentation just saying that my name is Dr. Alexander Wombold and that I use he, him, his pronouns. People can use a whole bunch of different pronouns. So he, him, his, and she, her, hers are really common options that many of us are familiar with, but some other ones might include they, them, theirs, or ze, zers, zers. Some people also might choose to use their name as a pronoun. So for example, they're Alex, Alex's, Alex's, or they might use a different noun altogether. It's like sir, sirs, sirs. And we want to make room for folks to potentially voice their pronouns as a way of letting them know that this is a space where it is okay if your gender identity doesn't necessarily match up with the sex you were assigned at birth, or if your gender identity doesn't necessarily match up with what I, as an outside person, might perceive it to be just by glancing at you. So with that, in etiquette, we want to just introduce ourselves with our own pronouns and make room if someone else would like to share theirs, that they're free to do so. So again, just hi, my name is Dr. Alexander Wombold. I use he, him, his pronouns. What's your name and what pronouns would you like me to use? That simple. That being said, we're going to encounter some mistakes along the way here. So it can be difficult when you've known someone by a particular name or by particular gender identity markers for most of their life to get used to that when they all of a sudden would like you to use new gender markers or a new name for someone. You're going to slip up periodically, and that's just going to happen. It's inevitable. The big thing there is when you accidentally use an incorrect pronoun or an incorrect name for someone, just correct your mistake and work not to repeat it. So if I accidentally call someone by the wrong name or use the wrong pronouns there, can just say like, oh, whoops, I'm sorry, I meant her book is on the table. Done. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, one of the big things is that when it comes to these risk factors, this is one way that it's been shown that all of us as an individual can have a huge impact on young people's lives. So I'd like to offer people this following finding, which is that for transgender and gender non-binary young people, their risk of attempting suicide, and again, please remember that a lot of LGBTQ young people who are experiencing homelessness actually state in their own understanding that they're experiencing homelessness as a way to avoid poor mental health that was occurring due to being in an unaffirming environment. And so for transgender and gender non-binary young people, their risk of attempting suicide decreases by over 50% if the majority of adults in their lives are just using their name and their pronouns as they would like them to be known. So making sure that we're all doing this and making that space is an important way that literally from the moment we step foot outside of the Zoom seminar today, we can work to create more supportive communities with folks just by changing that simple etiquette in introductions at absolutely no cost there. So that's something I would urge everyone to take home today. Last but not least, just want to show folks some ways to get involved with One Colorado if you are interested. Please feel free to reach out to us. Again, if you're interested in helping to pass anti-discrimination policies for LGBTQ folks, or if you're interested in advocating on behalf of the need of pro-equality candidates for LGBTQ folks, please come and get involved with us. We would absolutely love to have you. Ooh. And with that, I am finished,
Thank
folks.
you.
Yeah.
That was great, Alex. Thank you so much. I appreciate everything you had to offer. And there was a ton of information in there that I didn't know. So I was actually taking pictures with my phone so I can get all of those stats down and make sure that I'm using them in the future. So I appreciate that very much. And without further ado, Shauna, if you would like to share your face and your screen, we'll kick it off to you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And I agree, Meredith. It's fantastic to learn so much on a webinar, some education like this. So thanks, Dr. Al. You always come in with the best information. I'm Shauna Kempinen, and I'm the executive director at The Place in Colorado Springs, Colorado. We work with young people who are experiencing homelessness or on the verge of homelessness to really ignite their potential to move forward in their life, whatever that means for them. I've been doing this work for about 8 years. And previous to that, I was the executive director at Inside Out Youth Services, our LGBTQ plus youth center here in Colorado Springs. This is very near and dear to my heart and why I do this work. One thing that I wanted to share with you was probably one of the phone calls that sticks in my mind the most. It's about 3 years ago, and I was working here at The Place. And we got a phone call from a school counselor in one of the Eastern El Paso County school districts. And the counselor asked me what we could do to help a 17-year-old student who identified as a transgender female, because that young person's family was telling her that if she is going to stay in their home, she must dress, quote, like a boy, act like a boy, and be a boy. In their home. And also they actually told their 17-year-old child that if she could not do that, they found a place where she could go and kill herself. When we think about how many calls like that we don't get for young people who are not actually able to, in relationship, come up to a school counselor and talk about that, it's pretty incredible. So we have great relationships with schools and other youth serving organizations in the community. I would refer you back. Dr. Al has all of that great data. So I'm not going to go through too much of that. I am going to share a little bit more about what we do and what we see and how we work with a diverse sets of youth experiencing homelessness in our community here in El Paso County. So I'm going to share my screen. See if I can do that nearly as well as Dr. Al did. Okay.
I can see it.
Great, thank you. So the core programs at the place, when we talk about working with young people experiencing homelessness, there's a lot of data out there about what actually works for young people, what helps them move forward in whatever realm they think that is. It's all about working with a young person from where they are and talking to them about their strengths and where they want to go. So the central programs that we have are street outreach. We have a shelter program. It's about 20 beds for youth age 15 to 24. In street outreach, we actually have a team that's out on the street in parks along the alleyways, working with young people between 15 and 25 years old. That team just in the last year worked with more than 350 young people. The shelter, we might have 150 youth come through that program in a year on average. And we also have housing, which we call it housing, but it's really a home, right? No matter what your housing looks like. So right now, if your housing is a tent along a riverway, that is your home because it feels like your space. What we try to do is help young people see a way beyond that and find resources and support them in accessing getting into housing. We've got about 118 different young people out in housing across our community here in Colorado Springs right now. And then those core programs really have services that wrap around them. So there's education. Of course, a lot of young people are still going to high school and they want to continue that or getting their GED. So we work with youth to do that, whether it's going to GED, getting practice tests, making sure the bus will pick them up if they're going to a high school that's very far away from the shelter, for example. Because education, having a high school diploma is really one of the top indicators that if a youth can get out of homelessness, they will stay out of homelessness. Absolutely not a guarantee, right? Many people who have high school diplomas also are experiencing homelessness. Many people with college diplomas as well. But we know that if a young person really tunes into what they might want to do and starts to think about what they'll have to do to get there, that's the key. We also have just employment help. We think of it actually as employment engagement. I just learned today that we have a young person who's been doing job coaching with one of our case managers, and she actually just got a paid internship at one of the local arts organizations. So, employment and education can look like a lot of different things, really driven by the young person themselves. And throughout all of our programs, we also offer healthcare. Dr. Eric Attard is here, and he's going to talk a bit in particular about one of the programs that we use in our community in collaboration. But when we say health, it's really about all health, all well-being, whether that's mental health, emotional, physical, spiritual. We really try to help a young person tap into what they need and help them find ways to move into a healthier space, again, whatever they determine that to be. So before I show a little bit of data, something that not everybody has seen before and heard it put this way, but here in the United States, 1 in 10 youth between the age of 18 and 24 are going to experience homelessness this year. So this is not some small population, gee, they'll figure it out. Wow, there must be special services. This is absolutely your neighbor. This is your niece, your nephew, maybe your own child, maybe yourself. So it happens for a variety of reasons, and there is no shame if it happens. What we want to be able to do is, if a young person falls into homelessness, get to them within 24 hours so that they have a lot less risk in experiencing things like sexual assault on the street. So helping young people really access quickly if they do fall into homelessness is what organizations like The Place do. If you're from Denver, you know of Urban Peak, Together in Boulder, Caris in Grand Junction. So we're all over the state. There aren't very many of us, organizations, doing this sort of full convergence, between 5 to 10, depending on who you're counting and the kind of work that we're doing. Here in Colorado Springs, The Place worked with about 524 youth and young adults last year. So when it comes to LGBT youth, LGBTQ plus youth experiencing homelessness, I will reiterate a couple of the points that Dr. Al made. Between 25 to 40% of youth experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ plus. And those are only the young people who are actually feel safe enough to say that to someone. If we're having a conversation, to say, yes, that's me, right? So we really feel confident that this is way on that upper side, 40% or more of young people on the street. And this disproportionality, while it might be 5 to 10% of the general population who identify as LGBTQ+, this disproportionality is really because of the discrimination that this population has suffered over a long time. When you're in school and you walk by the teacher's lounge and you hear a teacher calling another teacher a name that has to do with their sexual orientation, right? These things have a real impact on young people from the time you're very young and you start to identify all the way through your life. So it's not surprising, honestly. It's awful, but not surprising that there's such a disproportionate number of LGBTQ+ youth experiencing homelessness. I'm going to mention that another population that certainly crosses over of young people experiencing homelessness are youth of color. In our community in El Paso County, that varies from between 30 to 40% of the young people who we work with. Again, really overrepresented as compared with the percentage in the general population. Again, that's about policies, structures, racism, what has happened for young people through their entire life. I was just talking to someone today about truancy and how LGBTQ+ young people and youth of color are particularly over-policed in their own schools. That's just data that we know. So it's unfortunate, but we know that they are overrepresented for those reasons, not because they're doing anything themselves. We also know that about 1 in 3 trans people who have tried to access an emergency shelter are actually turned away, or they walk away because a shelter or another kind of homeless service program is not really going to respect who they are, right? So if you're given, quote, the option, if you are a person who identifies as trans and non-binary in some way, and the person at the entry to the shelter says, oh, what really are you? You say your name is Jack, but what really are you? Who are you born as? You have to stay over in, the girls' side, for example, of a shelter situation. These things are highly detrimental. It puts trans young people, especially, at severe risk, because they're not going to go into that situation knowing that it could be harmful and the risk of assault. If a young person who identifies as Jack, but who a shelter provider says you have to stay over here where the women stay, right? This is going to be a real situation for them. So a lot of times people who are identified as trans, non-binary, queer in some way, are staying outside because there aren't services that are really treating them fairly. I'm glad to say that the Place and all of the other homeless youth providers across our state that are working on national efforts, we all understand that, and we work in depth to make sure that our teams are trained in cultural competency around a variety of different types of cultures and people, so that when a young person comes into our shelter, for example, we ask them, we say dorm A and dorm B. Dorm B is where people who are more male identified usually stay. Dorm A, where people who are usually more female identified stay. And it's phenomenal to see the faces of the young people who can't believe we even said that, right? So we have to do things as people working with youth experiencing homelessness to be able to make a really welcoming and inviting environment during one of the worst crises of a young person's life. And 1 out of 5 people who are transgender said that they were sexually assaulted while they stayed in a shelter. I have unfortunately had 2 or 3 different young people that I've known in the 8 years that I've been at the Place who have talked to us about having been at an adult shelter nearby. They might be 20 or 21. So they went to an adult shelter and they were assaulted there. So these things are real risks for young people, and especially LGBTQ+ young people. So I love, again, what Dr. Al had, and I'm definitely going to be copying all of his data. But what we know, some basic things that will really help and work with youth experiencing homelessness. Basically, treating youth, whoever they are, respectfully, and ensuring their safety in shelter and housing, And even as importantly, if not more important, ensuring there's equity for young people to be able to access different services. We keep an eye on that at the place to look at about how many youth who we're working with identify as LGB, for example. So if that's around 20 to 25% at a certain time, we then look at the data on how many youth are getting into housing. So if it's about the same, we think good. Even, if it's a little higher, that's still good and even better. But if we're not getting young people into housing in an equitable way, we really know we have to take a deep dive and look at what's happening there. And that sort of equity work is building, I think, more across the state and certainly more in our community, even as the adult people who work with adult services and people in homelessness are looking at that as well. So the access is really one of the most important things. Appropriately addressing young people. If I want to be called Shauna or her or Zer, doing that just helps me know that you're welcoming, and I can respect you because you're respecting me just as much. I wanted to say one other thing about some of the young people who we work with, and this goes for all of them. When a young person comes into an organization like ours, we're known on the street, we're a homeless shelter. And we are known as the place where a young person can come and change their life around. So when a young person walks through our door, what we ask them, one of the first things we ask them is, of course, how are you doing? Assess their situation, get them the basics that they need. And then we start to talk with them about, are there things going well? We respect how much strength it took for them just to get to our door. So we start to talk about strengths right away, because I think it's really easy to talk about, to focus on risk factors and here are the things that are wrong and here are some things that I need. But we also want to talk about what's on board already, because all of us like to start from that place, right? No matter who you are. And when the youth come through our door, we jot those things down. And the top 3 things that young people say are their strengths. They say they're really good working with people. They say they're super motivated, and that they're really good artists. So those are the top 3 strengths that the young people we're working with identify as. And that's across the board. So we really appreciate the chance to be able to talk a little bit today, and we're glad to answer questions as we get to that point. And I'm going to turn that back over.
Thank you so much, Shauna.
Yeah.
I've already been writing down a few questions I have as well. And I love that you just ended with focusing on people's strengths, because it's very easy in the homelessness space to always focus on all of the bad things that are going on. And there's lots of great things that are happening, and a lot of really strong organizations who are doing incredible work like the place. And so thank you. Without further ado, we will have our final panelist of the evening present for us, Dr. Eric Attard. And I'm going to let you share your screen, and I'll turn myself off.
Thank you, Meredith. You can hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm not having mic issues. Okay. And let me get this shared. Let's see. We figured this out once before.
Display settings.
Yep, can't seem to find it. There we
There
go.
you go.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, my name is Dr. Eric Attard. I work with Peak Vista Community Health Centers and the place down in Colorado Springs. Just a brief introduction about myself. My pronouns are he, they. I identify as a gay cisgendered male. I have a clinical doctorate in with a primary focus in human sexuality and sexual trauma, background in pediatric psychology, and a master's in marriage and family therapy. A little bit more on my background. Shauna and I have kind of followed each other around a little bit. I worked with Inside Out Youth Services as well while Shauna was there. I'm a former executive director of the Pride Center in Colorado Springs. I've worked with Colorado College in the last couple of years, and then Peak Vista in an integrated healthcare health center where we see a lot of Medicaid and un or underinsured clients. And then most recently working with the place, again in Colorado Springs. So the programs that I'm working with specifically, Shauna mentioned our 3 different programs that we've got at the place. We've got our housing, our outreach, and our shelter program. And the Healthy Transitions grant that my counterpart, Amber, and I are working on brings mental health services to youth in all 3 of those programs. So in the ways that we do that, we have 2 kind of different intervention types that we're doing. So we're doing kind of your regular therapy, right, where you meet with a counselor once a week for about an hour, and we'll work kind of a standard therapy session, right? But then we also have in the moment interventions. So our housing youth, typically speaking, we'll meet them again where they're at. Sometimes I'll meet those youth in their apartment, or we'll meet, I have one youth that we meet at the Broadmoor, and kind of walk around the campus of the Broadmoor, and do therapy there. We have our shelter youth. So our youth who are in the shelter will also do, again, those standard follow-up appointments, regularly scheduled therapy interventions. And then outreach specifically is where we see the most of those in the moment interventions. And what that's going to be is things like, to give a specific example, a couple of months ago, had a youth who is a new mom, and she had dropped by our drop-in center to pick up some resources and supplies. And while she was there, I got to have 8 to 10 minute conversation about ways to stave off postpartum depression. So it's a very brief, quick encounter. This is a youth that it's going to be difficult, right, for a lot of youth really to come in for a once a week meet in a stuffy office, typical therapy session. So instead, we meet the youth where they're at, right, and we provide those mental health services on the street. The other great piece to this program is the community partnerships that are both part of the grant, and then just in general, kind of a goal that we have built into this grant, right? As an employee technically of Peak Vista, that means that I have access to medical providers, dental providers, individuals who can help get clients enrolled with Medicaid. And so I often will spend time sitting with youth, getting them scheduled for appointments with medical providers, helping discuss one-on-one with those medical providers the unique needs of the youth that we're seeing. We also have a community partnership with Diversis, formerly Aspen Point, for a first episode psychosis program. So severe psychosis like schizophrenia, for example, typically is going to show up with this specific age group, the 15 to 25-year-olds. And so Diversis, we've partnered with them to be able to refer the more severe psychosis to those agencies like Diversis, for mental health care specifically related to those issues. I wanted to take the time that I had to present today to look specifically at mental health issues related to that are unique to queer youth and queer youth specifically. And then in a minute, we'll get to queer youth that are facing housing insecurity, at risk for homelessness or currently homeless. And I really want to, as a quick side note, want to recognize Dr. Wambolt pointing out the correlation of mental health issues with identifying as a queer individual in some way. It's a lot of the issues that these youth are struggling with, and a lot of the reason that they're homeless or facing homelessness is not isolated to their sexual orientation or their gender identity, right? It's a plethora of things that may be connected to their sexual orientation or gender identity, or may be related in some way, shape, or form, but there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. And so really addressing mental health is a key component in all of this. So general issues that queer youth may experience, right? Bullying, specifically cyberbullying, is a huge component, or a huge struggle that queer youth might be dealing with. the coming out process. And these days, that coming out process isn't just like a one-time, I'm sitting the family down for family dinner and saying, hi, I'm gay. It might be more, it's a ongoing process, right? So it's coming out to multiple times, and about multiple things, right? These individuals are figuring out who they are. So it might be they come out recognizing that they've got what they believe to be same-sex attraction, and then down the road they're identifying as gender nonconforming, and so that may change their coming out process in some way. Queer youth also have unique issues with accessing, with what they're exposed to on the internet, and being able to access, really, to put it pretty bluntly, accessing anything having to do with sex. So exposure to pornography, and exposure to like hookups. So we've got all of these hookup apps now, Tinder, and the queer youth specifically have access to Grindr, and the only ways that you can, the only screening, right, is to click a button that says, yes, I identify as over the age of 18, and that's it. So the exposure to sexuality and to sex specifically is extremely high for queer individuals. And when that is your go-to, right, is I want to learn more, so I'm going to go to the internet, and you type in gay men, what are you going to see, right? Religious influences. So I live in Colorado Springs, right? There's a few churches out here that are super open and affirming, which is awesome. And there's plenty of churches that aren't, right? And so that's a very unique issue that queer youth might be experiencing. HRT and GAS, that stands for hormone replacement therapy and gender affirming surgeries. Again, those are kind of fairly self-explanatory why those would be specific to queer youth. Pronoun usage, we've talked a lot about that tonight, which is excellent. I'm really glad we're going there. Resources for gender expression, just finding those tools and resources to express oneself how they identify. Be that having parents that are willing to buy them clothes, to when we talk about youth that are dealing with homelessness, having access to clothes, or is it just you get what you get, right? When you go to a shelter. Healthcare access and medical trauma. In general, in the medical field and the mental health field, we're seeing massive uptick in an issue that that we're referring to as medical trauma. And that's anything from meeting with docs and not feeling like you've been heard, to continuous misdiagnosis, to having medical providers refuse to treat you or treat you poorly, right? So when we talk about pronoun usage, just as an example, that constant exposure to providers just refusing to use your pronouns. And that's, again, specific to queer youth, but also on a general note, we're seeing a lot of medical trauma come in when we're addressing mental health issues. And then healthcare access, not knowing if it's a safe provider for you to go to, not having insurance or coverage, having certain services not be covered, right? There are plenty of insurances that won't cover anything having to do with gender affirming treatments, be that surgeries or even hormone replacement therapy. Having plenty of providers who are unwilling, because they're unfamiliar with hormone replacement therapy, to even pursue researching it, right? So some of the mental health specific issues that queer youth might be struggling with, trauma. Again, everything that I just put in the last category is going to lead to trauma. Mood disorders, depression, bipolar, and we've spoken a lot about that tonight already. Anxiety, identity formation. So youth 15 to 25, that is a stage in life where you're figuring out who you are, right? High school is all about fitting in. The popular individuals are the ones who are the most normal, right? And it's a huge struggle for any adolescent, let alone a queer youth, to deal with trying to fit in, to fly under the radar. And then as we age, we start looking for ways to stand out, which is great. But again, in what ways do we want to stand out? And all of this is going to impact your self-esteem. Queer youth, higher risk for self-harm. We've talked a lot about suicidality tonight. Eating disorders, and this actually has an interesting correlation to the internet and accessibility piece that I was talking about. So young gay men in particular, we're seeing a massive uptick in eating disorders and body image issues because we are constantly being bombarded with this is what your body's supposed to look like. This also impacts transgender individuals in higher rates uh, due to things like what your body type is supposed to be and what you versus what you feel like, right? So if you are a young biological female going through puberty and you're putting weight on in certain areas and fat in certain areas of your body, how does that correlate if you identify as male to what you would like your body to look like? Substance use, this may present more intensely in queer youth based off of all of the other things that we've talked about as far as mood, anxiety, substance use to self-medicate for those issues. And then being specifically targeted to use substances, there's very few places that queer youth can hang out, right? And as they turn 21 and can start going to clubs, that's kind of the sole place that a lot of queer youth feel like they can hang out. So they're spending a lot of times hanging out in bars. And then specifically dysphoria, and I really appreciate Dr. Wemble explaining what that feels like and what that looks like. It is, again, just to kind of reiterate that sense of not rightness between what how you feel and what your body looks like. So that's struggles unique to queer youth specifically, and then struggles and challenges faced by queer youth facing housing insecurity specifically. So queer or street culture and queerness, like I said earlier, it's hard to find community as it is, especially if you're queer. Queer youth become easy prey. And one of the ways that we'll talk about that is how that presents in shelters. But queer youth are, if you think about, well, I'll get to the shelter. That may be an easier way to go with this. So within adult shelters, you have mixed generations, mixed populations. And there's culture that exists within a lot of those environments that mimics in a lot of ways the prison system. And so as we know, queer individuals and how they're targeted in the prison system will often is represented in shelters as well. And so these youth become higher risk to be targeted because of the role that they're supposed to serve in that kind of an environment, the ways that they're viewed by predators in those environments makes them easier targets. Other issues specific to youth facing housing insecurity that relate to the shelters, faith-based shelters, which a significant portion of shelters are, might not feel trustworthy for that youth, right? It might not feel like a safe place to go. They may have had terrible experiences in the past with faith-based organizations and not feel like it's a safe space for them. Also, those faith-based shelters may not be trustworthy. So it might not just be an issue if it doesn't feel that way. It might also not be a trustworthy space for them. A lot of volunteers with great intentions will volunteer their time at a faith-based shelter and be bringing to the table a lot of biases that they have. And so these youth don't get the same support systems that they need, and they're confronted with a lot of expectations or judgment from people who are supposed to be there helping them. And then this is a really simple way to put this, but all of those issues from the previous slide, multiply them when you're dealing with housing insecurity, right? So how are you going to address gender dysphoria? How are you going to address that sense of not rightness with what you present on the surface? How are you going to access the resources you need to express your gender if you're living on the street, right? If you don't have access to expendable income to buy clothes on your own. I'm going to go back to that slide for just a second because I want to really kind of touch base on some of these and how they're specifically worse with those individuals addressing dealing with housing insecurity. We talked about internet and accessibility, and we've talked about the shelters and being prey. It is more easy to access to engage in some form of human trafficking or sex work through that access, right? And so these youth are now at greater risk for things like STD exposure. You've got, again, when you're dealing with housing insecurity, accessing healthcare is going to be more difficult, right? Because you don't have a consistent mode of transportation to get to those appointments. You may be embarrassed to go to those appointments. During the pandemic, just as an example, we had several youth who hadn't had access to a shower in almost 4 months. And so how are they going to feel about going into a medical appointment for a physical, right? So again, those all of those issues that in general are faced by queer youth are going to be amplified tenfold when you are exposed, when you're also exposed to housing insecurity. So how we address these issues in the mental health field, and what we're seeing right now as far as how we want to engage in these interventions, the approach needs to be trauma informed, right? And basically what we mean by trauma informed is recognizing meeting the youth where they're at with their specific traumas that they may have engaged in, and being considerate of that every step of the way. Addressing the social determinants, and this again speaks to something that Dr. Wambolt was talking about. How do we get you into housing? How do we get you those basic needs, so that we can then start working on some of the underlying issues that got you to where you're at in the first place, right? So when we're looking at somebody who's experienced a significant amount of trauma, and they're living on the street, and they don't know where their next meal is going to come from, we don't have the capacity to address things like, how are we going to fix the family system that you grew up in? How are we going to address this relationship discord that you have with your partner, or any of those deeper rooted issues, until you know you're safe, and you know where you're going to spend the night tonight, and you know that where you spend the night tonight is going to be a safe space for you. Things that we take into account when we're addressing these mental health issues. One of the interesting things that we're seeing is that once youth get into housing, a lot of these issues will rise to the surface. So now that we've got you into a safe space, the trauma that you've been suppressing and the history of trauma that you've been suppressing now gets to come to the surface because you have exposure, right? You have space to process that. Your brain, you're in a quiet space now. You're not living moment to moment. Other things that we consider when addressing the mental health issues, their queerness is just one part of the picture, right? There's all sorts of things. We never want to focus just on their sexual orientation or gender identity and assume that that is the issue. We always want to meet them where we're at. We've talked a lot about that tonight. And then another interesting thing that we're seeing is that social problems are generational in more ways than one. So in one way that what I mean by this is we've got grandparent trauma turns into parent trauma, turns into youth trauma, right? Most of us, our grandparents were abused in some way. That's what parenting was. And then generations down and moving down, we see that generational trauma. But also these social problems are generational in that a lot of the youth, and this is one of the good news is that I'm about to get to in a minute, a lot of the youth
Dr.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we only have 1 minute left. So I know you probably have so much more to say, but if you could get to the main tickets. Thank you.
You got it. Yep, absolutely. Good news. Youth are open and accepting, which is awesome. They're accepting their peers a lot. This is the generational piece that I was speaking to, right? It's mostly an adult issue that we're seeing as far as accepting. Youth 12 and up can access mental health care on their own. They don't need parental consent. That's awesome. Another bit of good news, the United States, especially this month, is full of rainbows. That's awesome to see. We're seeing more open and accepting communities, and recognition of the importance of access to mental health care services continues to grow. Things that you could do to be a good neighbor. Talked about using pronouns appropriately. Talk about, when you're talking to youth, talk about all of who they are and the things that they're dealing with. It is okay to ask questions. I want to be really clear about that one. You know, if you're afraid that it might be a dumb question or an inappropriate question, ask yourself the question first. You know, when did you know you were straight? Is a great way to think about that, right? Things not to do. Don't assume anything about the individuals that you're interacting with. Don't expect people to teach you. Never out anyone and never ignore the subject, and try your best not to get tongue-tied. With that being said, happy Pride. Thanks for the heads up on that time.
No problem. Thank you so very much. I've heard so many things that I have lots of research to do and a lot more to explore. So thank you all for joining today and for spending the time with us. I appreciate all three of our panelists. I'm sorry that we didn't get to Q&A. Thankfully, Alex and Shauna were both answering questions in the chat. So if you asked a question, it has been answered. I will send out an email tomorrow with additional details on other ways that you can be a good neighbor and ways that you can do some more research. And then just so you all know, our next event is on July 21st. It is Homelessness Beyond City Limits. So we're going to talk about homelessness in the suburban parts of our state. Please join us for that event. That's again on July 21st at 5 p.m. Also a virtual event for the rest of this year. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone.